shipping, aviation, two examples of areas where we still haven't figured out what our alternative to being able to fly and transport goods by ships are going to be. There is no zero carbon solution for any of those. So the reality is we're not, as a planet, let alone a country or let alone industry, in a position where we can deliver on a 1.5 degree objective. We're just not ready for it. But are we going to actually say, therefore, we're not going to be able to meet 1.5, let's just settle for 2? Nobody's going to say that. The pragmatic should say it, because otherwise what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a failure, because we cannot achieve 1.5 degree, but nobody wants to admit that.
Welcome to Smarter Markets, a weekly podcast featuring the icons and entrepreneurs of technology, commodities and finance, ranting on the inadequacies of our systems and riffing on ideas for how to solve them. Together, we examine the questions: are we facing a crisis of information or a crisis of trust? And will building smarter markets be the antidote? This episode is brought to you in part by Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management.
Welcome back to Commodities in Asia on Smarter Markets. I'm Dave Greely, Chief Economist at Abax Technologies. Our guest today is Peter Zaman. Peter is a partner at HFW in Singapore and has been practicing law in climate finance and the environmental markets since 2004. We'll be discussing what's been happening in the carbon markets this year, how it's been affecting countries and companies in Asia, and the change in mindset that we all need to find the path forward. Hello, Peter. Welcome back to Smarter Markets.
Hey, Dave. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. You know, it's the Thanksgiving holiday here in the United States, and as always, I'm very thankful to be able to catch up with you on what's happening in the carbon markets. And, you know, as we're in the end of November, looking back over the year, to me, it's felt like a tale of two markets, with voluntary carbon markets beset by many challenges and compliance markets, meanwhile, pushing ahead, albeit slowly. So I was curious for your perspective, Peter, what's been happening this year?
Well, first of all, happy Thanksgiving to you and to all of your listeners, particularly if you are spending the weekend listening to this. Yeah, I mean, 2023, I can't believe it's already over. It's gone so quickly, but a lot has happened, as you say. I think it's right. I mean, if you divide the 2023 developments as being voluntary and compliance distinct, I think you would say that the voluntary markets struggled because it's lost demand more than anything else. I don't think supply necessarily has disappeared, but definitely demand has disappeared, probably down to about a combination of number of factors. Increased inflationary costs has taken speculative capital out of the market. I think that's taken away some of the demand. I think on the supply side, the criticisms of some of the methodologies and some of the standards has shaken confidence a little bit in the integrity associated with some of the voluntary carbon units. And I think on the buy side, corporations who have otherwise thought they've been doing good things, either for CSR purposes or ESG purposes, are being attacked for doing so. So greenwashing allegations being thrown at them, even if they don't stick, they throw them at them, and that scares away the corporations. You know, I learned a new term this year, green hushing. I mean, that term didn't exist until last year. So yeah, all of these things are happening in the voluntary space, and, they have negative repercussions. On the compliance side, I think you're right. I mean, the EU has introduced shipping as international shipping emissions as a new sector in the EU ETS, and that's brought in a whole raft of global market participants who know nothing about the EU ETS and are desperately scrambling to understand how it works. I think the EU Commission, in introducing shipping, didn't understand the complexity of the shipping market. They thought they would do what they did with aviation and try and just drag them into the system, and they are coming into the system, but it's not easy because shipping as an industry is designed around a lot of different things, but avoiding liability and avoiding tax seem to be some of the main drivers as to how they're structured. So essentially, a lot of SPVs are now compliance entities for the EU ETS. And I'm not sure the EU ETS appreciates that, because what's the point making an SPV your compliance entity? Anyway, but that's how the EU Commission have, I think, bitten off more than they can chew. But of course, they've also introduced CBAM, which is an attempt to try and protect EU industries within the EU by saying imports into the EU of fertilizer, cement, steel, iron are all going to be taxed at the border. Depending on whether or not you have a local carbon price, you might get some kind of discounted treatment from the border price. Otherwise, you're paying EU allowance prices, which is essentially an exportation of the EU price to the rest of the world. So I think there's a lot of people, particularly those who are in Southeast Asia or Asia Pacific, who are big importers or exporters of those products into the EU, are scratching their heads wondering, where did this come from? Why does it apply to me? And I think that's another phenomena we're going to see play out a lot more in the sort of beginning of 2024 as people start doing their reporting obligations under CBAM. And that's a big thing. And I suppose I think of Article 6 as a hybrid between the compliance markets and the voluntary markets, because if you take Article 6.2 as your basis, then a lot of the voluntary methodologies and standards will have a role to play under Article 6.2. And therefore, I think of that, even though ITMOs are compliance instruments and therefore voluntary markets are playing a role in delivering a compliance instrument under Article 6.2, Article 6.4 clearly is a compliance market directly in its own right. But because you can use Article 6.4 units for CORSIA and in the voluntary space, there is that crossover. So I put Article 6 somewhere in the middle. And as you will know, there's been a lot of rollout of Article 6.2 bilateral arrangements and frameworks beyond what existed last year with the efforts of Switzerland. And now other countries are pushing it, many of them in Asia Pacific, including Singapore. And we haven't had any real finalized ones yet. We've had lots of MOU stage progress on that, but we expect finalized ones to be announced maybe in the lead up to COP28. So yeah, plenty going on.
Plenty, and you've laid out plenty in front of us. So I'd like to dig into some of those topics in a little bit more detail with you. Specifically, maybe we start off with the drying up of demand in the voluntary carbon markets. And I'm curious how this is affecting Asian companies and countries in particular. And on your side of the globe, are the companies mostly net buyers or sellers in the voluntary carbon markets?
Yeah, we're very lucky, Dave, in that even though we sit in Singapore, we actually serve and work with clients across the markets. So we often deal with buyers from Europe and sellers from Asia, and sometimes vice versa. So I think the truth to Asia Pacific's role in the voluntary carbon market is predominantly as an origination supply source. And I think the origination supply source exists. I think, obviously, if you think about what the role of the voluntary carbon market is, it's to deliver carbon finance from countries and corporations that are otherwise emitting the greenhouse gases or taking on the responsibilities through their various pledges to do something about it, to the countries that are actually able and can afford to achieve carbon abatement and mitigation at a more cost-effective basis. So there is a transference of climate finance or carbon finance from what I call the global north to the global south. And actually, many of the global south countries exist in Asia Pacific. So when you think about the role of APAC, I predominantly think of it as a supply source for voluntary carbon credits. But if there's no buyer demand for these credits, then where is the money going to come from? And why would that carbon finance therefore flow from the global north to the global south? And the voluntary carbon markets are struggling because with no buyers buying voluntary carbon units, there is essentially no reason for that finance to flow. So there is a clear blockage of that finance right now in the absence of buyer demand. So when people ask me what is the most fundamental thing we can do to try and fix the issues with the voluntary carbon markets, I always say you've got to unblock the buyer demand. And if you go back to what I said earlier on, the buyer demand is predominantly arising because corporations think they're doing good things and then people attack them nonetheless. And therefore, you've got to overcome the challenges that are leading up to that kind of action being one that scares the corporations from doing something. And, there are a number of initiatives out there, including what the VCMI are doing, but we can get stuck into that separately if you want to. And I suppose the other thing I would say is that there's been historically a lot of carbon projects which have existed under pre-Paris Agreement legal environments. And as you know from previous conversations on Article 6, one of the consequences of Article 6 is that countries have to pass national frameworks. And these national frameworks talk about how they will authorize Article 6 activity. But all of those countries who are passing those frameworks will also say, by the way, any GHG mitigation activity in my jurisdiction now has to be approved by me. Then you get into the problem of these countries either not having the frameworks or are still in the process of implementing the frameworks. And then you get to examples of Indonesia where the frameworks are already in place. And Indonesia says, oh, but I can't make up my mind. Do I need these credits to meet my own NDC? Therefore, can I afford to export them? I'm not sure. And I think those kind of challenges are also an obstacle to some of the supply opportunities coming out of APAC. It's a time-limited problem because the countries will need to resolve and put their networks in place, and they are coming. These frameworks will come, and these frameworks, once they are in place, should start unblocking some of the supply flow, at least as a regulatory risk for any project developer.
Yeah, and with this blocking of the supply of carbon finance and the demand for carbon projects, do you think this is more of a temporary pause while we transition to an Article 6 world? Or is there something more behind the pullback in climate finance we've seen this year?
I think if you look at your question from the perspective of the host country, from a host country's perspective, yes, this is a transition from what I would call a pre-Paris Agreement Kyoto framework to a Paris Agreement framework. And that in that transition, these countries are struggling. So you can't underestimate how difficult it is for a country who's never had to collect information about the sources of its emissions, find a way to harmonize the data collection under IPCC rules and requirements, and then find a way to report that in a way that enables them to meet their Paris Agreement reporting obligations that they've taken on and for the first time since 2021. Contrast that to what countries who, under the Kyoto Protocol, there are only about 38 or 40 countries who have been reporting their greenhouse gas information and doing the accounting for 20 plus years. And for them, doing an NDC is something they can take in their stride because they have the data, they understand how to look at the data, and they understand what the data means. When you're dealing with a country, including those in Asia Pacific, who have never had to handle that data, use the data, let alone analyze the data, and yet are being told you must produce an NDC by certain dates, and in that NDC you must take in a lot of commitments. The truth is a lot of people took on NDC's commitments without understanding how they were going to deliver them. And they certainly didn't have a plan of action that would say, if I do X, Y, and Z, I lead to this amount of reduction, and therefore this is how I achieve my objective. So what you're seeing in a lot of countries today, particularly those global south countries who have less capability than the global north countries in terms of capacity building and capability to do these analysis, you're seeing a lot of hesitation and uncertainty about what to do. And I don't think it's helped by the fact that in the capacity building efforts that we have seen so far, there has been an inconsistency in the communication around what the point of corresponding adjustment is, and certainly what the cost of a corresponding adjustment is. And I think the mixed messages that the countries are receiving from their advisors, from the market, from the industry, have left them pretty confused to the point where they're too hesitant to make a decision because they can't make a wrong decision because at the end of the day, they're government officials. And there is a history of there being clear-cut consequences of signing up to things that you don't understand and then realizing afterwards that you shouldn't have done so. And, you've heard me talk about this in the past in the context of the outside NDC, inside NDC distinctions, and in particular, that fact that corresponding adjustment applies to outside NDC activities as well. So that error, which I think happened, is not an error that they can overcome because I don't see the Article 6.2 rules being rewritten easily, but I think they're stuck with it. And of course, now they have to appreciate the consequences of being stuck with it. And I think that has been a cause of some of the blockage. So is that a blockage on the supply side, or is there a bigger blockage on the demand side? And I think for me, the demand side blockage is the bigger issue because there are plenty of countries that are very happy to sell because some of their frameworks are already in place. I mean, if you think about how many bilateral arrangements Singapore is putting in place right now as a country looking to buy Article 6 credits, the carbon finance flow will flow as soon as those frameworks are done. And that's just a matter of time. And from what I understand, the methodologies that they're agreeing to under which the supply will happen is relatively a well-trodden path because Singapore knows the methodologies and the standards they're comfortable with. It's just a question of whether or not the selling countries' existing NDC and their priorities match up with the criteria that Singapore wishes to apply. And that's a similar principle that will apply across any buying country's relationship with any selling country. So all of that will play out, but that's not the main blockage. I think the main blockage is their demand. So Singapore carbon tax is a good example of something we're seeing now generating demand for Article 6 credits, because Singapore carbon tax has, even though it's $5 today, is going to be $25 very soon, and it'll be up to $40 very soon after that. And because it's sending a price signal, those price signals can allow selling countries to work out from a cost perspective what kind of price they can reasonably expect to sell. And if you send a price signal like Singapore is doing through its carbon tax, any other buying country will be in competition with Singapore to match that price, because the seller country will say, well, I have a choice of selling it to Singapore or to Japan. If Japan's not paying me $40, I'm going to sell it to Singapore. So these are good things, right? You're sending a price signal, you're pushing up the carbon price, but it doesn't change the bigger dilemma that I think ultimately we are going to face under Article 6, which is there are so many more selling countries than there are buying countries. America, Europe, the UK, these are all examples of countries who have potentially large demand in order to meet their NDCs for Article 6 credits, but they've currently said that they're not interested in supporting Article 6 for those purposes. Yet those are the people heavily influencing the negotiation around the rule book, even though they're not showing up for the party. So what you do have, therefore, is very much of what I call a buyer's market today, because there's only a handful of them, and there are many, many more sellers. So the buyers can play the sellers off against each other as a result of that, which is why we're now seeing countries where corresponding adjustment prices should be in the ranges of the $20+, but they're selling them at $5. And why? Because they recognize that they are in competition with other countries, and if they hold to their true cost of the corresponding adjustment, then they're not going to get any money at all. But all they're doing when they do that is that they're taking on a cost that they still have to pay, but they just defer the cost for their next NDC. So again, it goes back to this question about, is Article 6 going to support the revenue of carbon finance moving from the global north to the global south? Whether if there are only a handful of buying countries, then the answer to that has to be no. So if all of that is true, then isn't that exactly why we need the voluntary markets? Because then the voluntary markets can step in and make up for the shortcomings of the Article 6 markets, which would be great, except for the fact that we've scared away all the voluntary market demand, and we've persuaded people, wrongly in my view, that you can't have a good voluntary market credit unless there is a corresponding adjustment attached to it. So what you're doing is you're tainting the voluntary markets with all of the problems of the Article 6 markets, which is the corresponding adjustment cost. And you're therefore saying to the host country that it makes no difference to you whether or not you sell voluntary or you sell ITMOs, because the cost of the corresponding adjustment for you is more or less the same. So what you can't get in the Article 6 markets, we're going to make sure you don't get in the voluntary markets either. So we've exported the blocker that has been introduced to carbon finance from the global north to the global south in the Article 6 rulebook, unnecessarily in some instances, into the voluntary market. So then the question is it justified that the voluntary market requires a corresponding adjustment? Because if it doesn't have it, then the carbon credit lacks integrity. Well, there are many, many reasons why I disagree with that position. But the biggest argument that people have said and used to argue why you need a corresponding adjustment for a voluntary carbon credit is what's called displacement. That if you allow voluntary carbon finance to flow into countries who are going to carry out these activities pursuant to their NDC, then you financing that activity is displacing them spending the money that they could be spending elsewhere to do additional mitigation activity. And actually, that may be true to the extent that the mitigation action you're financing happens to sit inside your NDC. But if there are activities that sit outside your NDC, and because of common but differentiated responsibilities and the principle that's enshrined in Article 4 of the Paris Agreement, countries will all have NDCs, but not necessarily the same NDC and not necessarily the same targets. There are going to be countries that have NDCs with outside NDC areas. And for those areas to say that you're displacing the activity that would be carried out because you're financing it in the voluntary market is wrong. Because only if the activity were inside the NDC does that argument ring true. But we've not tried to make that differentiation. We've basically swept everything under the same rug by saying any voluntary carbon credit without a corresponding adjustment is bad. And that's not true. So even if you took the best of their arguments and you tried to rationalize it, it doesn't stand up to rational thought. But then we see, not instead of people challenging the logic or the rational for why that statement is being made, people are saying, well, you know what? I'm too lazy to have that conversation. So I'm just going to run from the conversation and I'm going to say, you know what? Let's forget corresponding adjustment. We're just going to hide it under a mitigation contribution claim argument. What the hell is that? I mean, when I think about the nature of what drives voluntary carbon market demand, it's relatively simple. I have emitted 1 ton of carbon. I wish to compensate for the cost of that 1 ton. I need to find a -1, which is the accounting treatment that you apply to a carbon reduction or carbon removal. And if those two numbers neutralize each other, then I've probably neutralized some of the harm that I've done. And if that's the concept of offsetting, which is exactly what's enshrined in the Article 6 rulebook, which is enshrined in international treaties like ICAO and adopted for CORSIA, and corporates are wishing to do the same thing, why is that necessarily suddenly a bad thing? It wasn't bad 18 months ago, but now it seems to be disastrous to say that you're trying to offset your carbon footprint. And therefore, we're running from the question of why is that bad, and instead we're saying, you know what, we're going to mitigation contribution claim, but that way we're going to do all the things that we would do with an offset. We're just going to not say we're neutralizing our carbon footprint. Well, if you're not neutralizing your carbon footprint, why are you buying these things? Oh, because you're doing good and you're a good corporate citizen. Okay, well, that's fine, but then I'm just using my corporate CSR budget. I mean, we want to move carbon finance from, even in the voluntary space, from the global north to the global south to the mainstream. And the amount of investment that needs to go to the global south is so large that CSR budgets are not going to cut it. You need corporate action to make it part of their main business. It has to be part and parcel of how they go about doing business. You need the cost of carbon to be internalized to the point where it's the internal cost of carbon that the companies have, which is being used for these purposes, not your CSR budget. And yet that's what we're doing. We're pushing to say, well, at least you'll use the CSR budget for mitigation contribution claims. And frankly, I don't need the voluntary markets for that. If I want to write a charitable check to a country to help them meet their NDCs, I'll go and do that. I don't need the voluntary market to tell me why I should go and do that. So I don't believe mitigation contribution claims, whether the beyond value chain one argued or proposed by the SBTI or VCMI's corporate claims guidelines, I don't think any of them are really going to get there because there's no accounting benefit to the corporate who's making a mitigation contribution claim. And if there's no accounting benefit, then you're limited to the CSR world. And for the reasons I just mentioned, I just don't think that's the answer. I've been having a rant, so I'll stop there.
No, your rant's making me think. And, one of the things that I've heard a lot over this year is people in the voluntary markets looking to Article 6 as kind of the answer to the voluntary carbon markets problem, that we need someone to step in and say that this credit has integrity, that it's quality, that it qualifies as an offset. If we can get the voluntary markets under the Article 6 framework, we'll have that, demand will come back, and we can move forward. So I think there's been that point of view, that hope in a sense. But when I hear you talk about it, then I also hear that, well, if you look at things from the compliance market standpoint, or like the NDC Article 6 side, we're asking a lot of countries in the global south to be able to deal with the level of bureaucracy, the level of needing to do the carbon accounting, the greenhouse gas accounting, that in one sense, for them, the voluntary carbon markets were probably a much more straightforward path to getting that carbon finance. So looking at it from both sides, are we making it too hard? This is something that we need to take action on. We need to get the money flowing. We need to get these projects moving. We need people to be reducing their emissions footprint on their own as well. And are we making it too hard and kind of always hanging this carrot out there of, in another year, something will happen, quote something, and then we'll know what to do? Because it seems like there's no easy answer out there right now, listening to you.
I speak to clients about themes like this on a daily basis, and I can tell you that every person is scratching their head wondering what the hell happened. And the reason they're doing that is because everything that they understood about the way in which voluntary carbon markets operates has essentially been turned on its head. And you get to the point where you say, well, hang on a second, just like green hushing wasn't a thing 5 minutes ago, where did this come from? I've never heard that term before. Are people just making this up? And there is an element of course, buyer beware, but there's also an element of buyer becoming more aware. And of course, if you then take the view that the interest in the climate change challenge has attracted more attention from academia, more attention from NGOs, more attention from significant intellectuals, as well as from financial institutions, it's only right to say that the market would face scrutiny. But there's a difference between criticisms for the sake of criticism. There's a difference between saying that I want to be constructive, but I want the market to continue. And there is a big difference between saying, you know what, this offset thing that you've been doing for the last 20 years, that's completely rubbish. Let's just throw it out and start from scratch. And I think I'm very happy with the criticism. I'm very okay with people challenging what has happened before. But I'm not okay with the idea that we're just going to throw everything we've done in the last 20 years out and then start from scratch. And by the way, we're going to bet on this new thing that nobody's ever heard of. At least 20 years ago, didn't hear of it, and nobody can afford it, and nobody knows how to deliver it. And by the way, it's a kind of a pie in the sky moment right now, but we still think it's better than what we've had before, and we're going to throw all of our resources behind that. I'm referring to removals, of course. And I don't say that removals are bad. I think removals have definitely a role to play, and they're an important role to play, but they are also something that are, even according to the IPCC, a role that needs to be played for 2050. It's not a role that must be played today. True, we need to scale it up, and we're starting from a low baseline, so obviously it takes time to build it up. But you don't do that at the cost of reductions. The IPCC has also made it clear that we can't stop reducing our emissions just because we're going to throw everything into the removals bucket in 2050 onwards. And therefore, the real challenge for us is how do we remove emissions today whilst building up and scaling up our removals capability? How do we reduce emissions today and build up our removals capability to be ready for it by the time that we hit net zero in 2050? And I think that thing recognizes that you have to take what you have learned for the last 20 years and put it to use. You can't just say, I'm going to pretend like all of that 20 years of experience and knowledge is worth nothing because it's taught me something that it doesn't work. I'm just going to throw all of that away, and I'm just going to bet on something in the future that is untried and equally untested. I absolutely assure every person I speak to who is talking up removals today is that there are lots of questions about removals that you haven't yet even thought about. Just the way, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back at reductions and say, you know what, there's a whole bunch of things you guys didn't think about 20 years ago, but we with the benefit of hindsight, are now able to tell you got wrong. I can assure you that in 20 years' time, somebody will be saying that about removals as well. And that's because we have to learn through experience. But the experience isn't wasted and can't be wasted because we don't have the time or the luxury of time to say, you know what, we're just going to start with something brand new. Maybe that will work better. You've got to take what you've got and you've got to build back with it, and you've got to use it to the best of your ability. So to your point, are we going to necessarily fix things in a year? I think the answer to that is no, not unless there is a radical change in the destructive nature of the conversation we're having with people about removals versus reductions, the role of offsets, the notion that we should be critical of companies who are voluntarily doing stuff they're not obliged to do, but voluntarily doing stuff, and then say to them, how dare you voluntarily do stuff? Because what you're doing is absolutely not what you're supposed to be doing. And what I tell you to do must be what you do, because only what I say is good enough. And my point is, they're doing it voluntarily. They're probably doing a lot more than you're doing. And in fact, the contribution that they're making probably is much greater than the contribution you could individually make, because they're a large corporation doing it at scale. So why don't you appreciate the efforts that they're doing? Why don't you encourage them to do more rather than scare them into doing nothing? Because that's the effect of what you've achieved. So is that really the healthiest way for us to be doing this? And I think that's call it the pragmatic in me asking the question, because from an ideological perspective, of course, you can say extremely righteous things about some things, and equally, you can say equally villainous things about other things. But really, the truth is, most of us who live in the world live in this probably middle ground area where we're perfectly happy to say we'll do the best we can. It may not be as good as you want it to be, but it's certainly a lot better than doing nothing. And my worry is that we're leading towards either do this or do nothing at all. And I don't think that's going to help us.
No, not at all. And maybe I should ask you, you'd mentioned a little bit earlier CBAM being launched this year and the shipping sector being brought into the EU ETS. So in terms of that kind of incremental progress, building on something that's gone before, that kind of philosophy, how is that working? And do you see that as good for carbon markets?
So CBAM's a very, very interesting one because I don't think it's so much about carbon markets as it is about politics. And I say this with the experience of what has happened over the course of the last couple of years. So you need to take a step back and ask yourself, what is CBAM really there for? And the answer on the face of it is it's there to stop companies who are producers of these products inside the EU from suffering from anti-competitive challenges where countries and exporters who are outside the EU can produce the goods at a lower carbon cost than they have. And this is because companies inside the EU have to, or historically have had to, pay the EU allowance price, even though they've benefited from free allocation as a protectionist measure. What the EU has done with its Fit for 55 package is to say, my Fit for 55 package requires me ultimately to decarbonize within the EU. I can't be decarbonizing if I'm going to be giving away free allowances and continuing to protect these sectors. But at the same time, I can't have these sectors therefore exposed to international carbon price competition when the competitors outside the EU do not pay a similar carbon price. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to impose a tax at the border for imports. And if the countries that those imports are coming from don't have a similar carbon price, they'll have to pay the top up. So Indonesia exports steel to the EU. Indonesia has a carbon price, roughly about $2. The EU carbon price is 85 euros. There's a big difference between them. All of that money should now be paid to the EU as a consequence of Indonesia's carbon price not being high enough. Now, if you're Indonesia, you're saying, actually, that's quite interesting. The EU is going to keep money from my corporations because they're selling to the EU. So what are my choices? I don't sell to the EU. I sell it to some other country that doesn't have a similar CBAM restriction. Oh, but the UK is not going to be one of them because the UK is now introduced or is going to introduce their own CBAM from 2026. But I can sell it to China. China doesn't have a CBAM. So maybe that's where my steel goes. Or if I do want to sell it to the EU, then I just have to recognize that I have to pay this price. Are those really my choices? And the answer from the EU is no. You change your $2 price to a $40 price or a $60 price. Do what Singapore's doing, right? And as a result of which, when your exports come, you get a better discount than everybody else. Or rather, you pay less taxes when they come in because there's still going to be some disproportionate price differential between your Indonesian carbon price and my EU carbon price. And Indonesia says, well, yeah, I suppose the benefit of that is that I get to keep that revenue myself because instead of my exporter paying you the tax, my exporter now pays me the tax. So I'm encouraged to put up a carbon price in Indonesia. That's great in theory, because what we do want to do is we do want to encourage carbon pricing. And the question really is, though, if you have common but differentiated responsibilities under the principles of the Paris Agreement, which then say, different countries can meet their commitments under the Paris Agreement at different paces because we recognize that they have different circumstances and they have different capabilities. We all have a common goal, but we don't have to reach the goal at the same time. And interestingly enough, we're coming up to the global stocktake at COP28. And of course, we're going to say, well, are the existing pledges currently good enough for us to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement? To which I suspect everybody already knows the answer is no. But it's the Paris Agreement that nonetheless recognizes that it's the EU's job to set a 2050 net zero goal, but India doesn't have to do that. India can do a 2070 net zero goal. So if by definition India has a 2070 window that is different from the Europe's 2050 window, why is it that Indian exporters have to pay the EU's price for carbon? Why is it that CBAM doesn't allow and recognize common but differentiated responsibilities as enshrined in the Paris Agreement in the manner in which it deals with exporters from different countries? At the moment, it does not make that differentiation. So do I think a common carbon price is capable of being achieved under the Paris Agreement? The answer to that is no. We could have done that with the Kyoto Protocol, but we changed from a top-down approach to a bottom-up approach. And under the bottom-up approach, you have a fragmented carbon price. The European CBAM exercise is the one that will export the EU carbon price to all other parts of the world. Is that necessarily a good thing? I think the answer is it could be, as long as it's done in a fair way that recognizes the respective efforts that those countries are obliged to put in under the Paris Agreement versus the ones that they are not obliged to put in. In other words, you have to differentiate between countries in a way that treats the country's circumstances and capabilities for what they are. And presently, CBAM doesn't do it. And you can see that playing out in the shipping space as well. So if you think of a Singaporean ship owner whose ship is being used for voyages for delivering goods into EU, and you look at a ship owner from a Liberian flag state or from any other country, a least developed country, you can see that the EU ETS doesn't differentiate between how they treat the Liberian flag carrier versus the Singaporean flag carrier. And you know what? Common but differentiated responsibilities is not enshrined in the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, whose jurisdiction international shipping emissions is. So the EU, by introducing the EU ETS, bringing the shipping sector for international shipping emissions into the EU ETS, is first of all encroaching into IMO territory. But they have a history of doing that. They did the same thing with ICAO when they brought aviation into the EU ETS, international aviation. So they're encroaching into IMO territory. IMO doesn't have a common but differentiated responsibility distinction. And therefore, I guess the EU's argument would be, well, we're just doing what the IMO isn't doing, and we're doing it in a way that we think is fair. And if you don't like it, tough luck. Do something of your own, which is an invitation to the IMO, which they have already recognized, to develop their own carbon pricing scheme, which they have said they will do on a carbon intensity basis by 2025. We shall see what that looks like. And if they do introduce that, maybe then we start seeing a fairer allocation or a fairer treatment of how shipping for countries is dealt with under the GHG frameworks of the IMO versus the EU ETS and the Paris Agreement. But at the moment, there is no difference in the export of the carbon price to any of these particular countries.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to one point. If it requires too much detail, you can wave me off. But it sounds like you were saying that within the framework of the Paris Agreement, it doesn't allow, I guess, for the emergence of kind of the idea of a global carbon price. And I think that would be surprising to many people because they think, well, if you have the accounting that covers all the countries and then you throw in international shipping, you throw in international aviation, you've got the globe covered in terms of the plus ones and minus ones of emissions and removals. And that would then set you up to be able to have a price for those emissions and removals. What are we missing there in terms of why that's not enough?
So, of course, Article 6 is an arrangement that recognizes cooperation between countries in sharing their respective burdens. So the idea, of course, of Article 6 is that a buying country and a selling country can work together to raise ambition on what they can do. One easy example is if a country can't afford to do something in the absence of support, and another country comes in to say, no, you guys go ahead and do it, I will support you. That's a way in which both people are now achieving greater ambition because the conditionality attached to the selling country was that I need money. Somebody has stepped in to say, here's the money, now please do it. And that leads to greater ambition. That leads to a transfer of finance. But again, that's a bilateral arrangement that isn't representative of a common basis for comparing efforts. And what do I mean by that? So if you take Article 6.2, Article 6.2 is a series of arrangements that countries agree with each other. What they consider to be an acceptable grade of a carbon ton reduction or mitigation or removal varies from country to country. There's no universal standard. So somebody in a race to the bottom to buy the cheapest ITMO could settle for the cheapest methodology or the worst methodology or the most generous baseline. And these are within the discretions of the negotiating buying country and selling country. So you will find that not all ITMOs are going to be environmentally equal. There are some ITMOs that will come from generous baselines. There's some ITMOs that will come from less generous baselines. Ultimately, the determination of what is good enough is a matter for bilateral conversation between parties. So we live in a world where the Paris Agreement's bottom-up approach, which basically says to the countries, I'm not going to impose a single set of rules on you to tell you what to do. That was the Kyoto Protocol. You didn't want that. We threw that out. We now accept that you want to do things at your own pace and your own way and do it with your own freedoms, and we'll let you do that. And that's what Article 6 also recognizes, because it doesn't prescribe the minimum criteria that has to be met by countries who are negotiating what is good enough to be an ITMO. Article 6.4, in contrast, has a minimum common standard. And as you will know from, I think, the last podcast we did together and the paper we wrote on the subject, we compared the sort of preferences from a private sector perspective of, what do I invest in 6.2 or 6.4? And one of the criteria we assessed was environmental integrity. And we basically took the view that you've got a better chance of there being more environmental integrity in the 6.4 mechanism than there is in the 6.2 mechanism. So at least there will be a consistency in what the quality will be. I think the problem with 6.2 is there's going to be an inconsistency. And as soon as your product varies in quality, you can't have a single price for it, because perceptions of the value of that product will change. And therefore, you can't have a single common price for Paris Agreement eligible units coming through the Article 6 framework. And that's kind of the reason why I say you can't have a single carbon price. And even if you did, because these are ultimately minus ones from a greenhouse gas accounting treatment, they're not the same thing as a plus one, because a plus one, which is with the EU allowance carbon price, is the aggregated cost of emissions generated in the EU, which is a place where the cost of decarbonization is very high. The cost of decarbonization in an APAC country is much lower. So actually, you can't compare an Article 6 decarbonization price that comes through from an Asian produced ITMO with a EU allowance price, which is the cost of decarbonization across aggregated sectors in the EU ETS. The plus one is a diametrically opposite thing to a minus one from an accounting perspective. And therefore, the reason why you say an EU allowance price justifies the price of a global carbon price isn't true. Because if you tried to say, well, what would be the cost of a decarbonized ton in the EU, it would probably be more than 100 euros. If you look back at the World Bank paper of the mitigation outcome cost, or the corresponding adjustment cost of a mitigation outcome in the EU, that number, if memory serves right, was an aggregated 145 euros, which means that price is higher than the cost of an EU allowance today. So even the EU allowance price is not a true cost of a comparison if you want to do an apples against apples comparison against an ITMO. So therein lies the problem of why you can't have a single carbon price through the Paris Agreement.
Got it. And while we're lacking a single carbon price, while we don't have kind of that full accounting around the world at this point either, we do have this patchwork quilt of compliance markets in different countries that are kind of putting a price out into the world. You've talked a lot about the EU with CBAM. You had also mentioned the Singapore carbon tax as an approach to this. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on that, because it is a different approach. Instead of a cap and trade system, it's let's set the price through the tax. How do you think about that, and why did Singapore make that choice?
It's very interesting that when I first arrived in 2016 in Singapore and I introduced myself to the Singapore market, at some point I spoke to the regulators, and the regulators said, oh, you know something about carbon? Answer this question to me. Do you think we should have a cap and trade scheme or we should have a carbon tax? And my answer to them immediately was, you have absolutely no logical reason to put in place a cap and trade scheme, because for a cap and trade scheme to work, you need market pricing, you need market price discovery. You don't have enough market participants in the Singapore market that you would be able to create a liquid market with. So your price discovery process through an ETS in Singapore would not work. So the most efficient thing for a small country like Singapore is a carbon tax. And that's what they announced. So no surprises there, frankly. They announced it with a $5 price, which of course was not necessarily out of sync with where the rest of Asian countries were sitting in the carbon price spectrum at that point. What Singapore has done more recently is really quite symbolic in making the announcement that by 2030, it will have a carbon price in excess of 50 Singapore dollars. And that is probably amongst the highest carbon prices in anywhere in Asia. And in that sense, Singapore has done something quite brave. But Singapore can afford to do it. Singapore is not a global south country. Singapore is a wealthy global north country, and therefore, as a global north country, its cost of decarbonization is high. So ultimately, it's recognizing that, and therefore, even a $50 price is probably a palatable compromise, not a true reflection of the actual cost of its decarbonization. So you get to the point where, at some point, inevitably, the carbon tax becomes still partially subsidies rather than a true cost of decarbonization in Singapore. But carbon taxes, unlike cap and trade prices, are an instrument of policy. Carbon prices in a cap and trade system, generally speaking, are determined by the market. True, you can influence it as the policymaker by changing the supply and demand curve, which is kind of what the EU ETS does with its Fit for 55 package by saying that the number of free allocation of allowance is going to reduce, the amount of available allowances is going to reduce over time. That's the way in which the policy makers can influence the price of an EU allowance price, but they don't control it. The market dictates that. Contrast that with the Singapore carbon tax as an example. It's a government number. They decide the number is 50. Tomorrow they decide the number is 70. And then it's a question for what will the taxpayer accept in that environment. So is there a role for a carbon price? Absolutely. Whether it's determined through cap and trade market principles or whether or not it's determined as a government setting prices through a carbon tax, both work. It's just that there are different economic drivers and politics that drive the principle as to what the number is and how that number was reached. And I think that's the difference. So for Singapore carbon tax is a good thing and it works.
And I want to thank you for spending this Thanksgiving holiday with us, Peter. Before I let you go, though, I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you your thoughts on COP28 coming up in Dubai. I wanted to get your thoughts on, your expectations for the event. What deliverables do you think we need from COP this year? What do you think we'll get? But I almost wonder, given your rant a little bit earlier in the conversation, more than technical details, do we need a change in mindset?
We definitely need a change in mindset. My expectations for COP28 are low. We are all going in there very well aware that we're miles off a 1.5 degree target. And theoretically, to reach our 1.5 degree target, we're supposed to peak global emissions by 2030. And if that's true, then the global stocktake has to deliver that. But the practical problem is that to do that, you can't have any more coal, you can't have any more oil, and we have to replace all of that with something alternative. We don't have any alternatives that are of that scale that can step in and replace them today. Shipping, aviation, two examples of areas where we still haven't figured out what our alternative to being able to fly and transport goods by ships are going to be. There is no zero carbon solution for any of those. So the reality is we're not, as a planet, let alone a country or let alone industry, in a position where we can deliver on a 1.5 degree objective. We're just not ready for it. But are we going to actually say, therefore, we're not going to be able to meet 1.5, let's just settle for 2? Nobody's going to say that. The pragmatic should say it, because otherwise what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for a failure, because we cannot achieve 1.5 degree, but nobody wants to admit that. And from my perspective, it's a bit like my father saying to me when I was younger, if you study hard aiming for an A, you probably will get a B. But if you target a B, you're going to get a C. And I think the 1.5 degree, 2 degree target thing is a bit like that. We have to aim for 1.5 degree because otherwise there's no chance we're going to hit 2 degrees. But if we go in there without being honest about the reality of why we're doing what we're doing, we are setting ourselves up for failure. And as soon as it fails, then everybody says, oh, this didn't work. I told you it wasn't going to work. This is rubbish. We're going to replace the Paris Agreement with something else that works. Well, we did that in 2009 when we replaced Kyoto with the Paris Agreement, and we had this 10 years of people doing nothing. So that's the reality of how long it takes to put in place an international treaty. So I don't advocate for throwing out the Paris Agreement. I advocate for getting people to work together, for people to collaborate. And yet, even before we've started COP28, we know there are people setting it up for failure, because you'd want to be able to say, I told you we couldn't have a good COP when we have, the chairman of ADNIC or the CEO of ADNOC running it. How could anybody have thought in their right mind that that was going to work? Well, to be honest, you haven't given the guy a chance. So you've already gone in there with a presumption that this is going to fail, or that they're going in there to drive their agenda. But you haven't sat down and said, but does their agenda make any sense? So you do get the sense that people are going to Dubai expecting a fight. And my point is, you can fight, but fight about the things that really are constructive, that push things forward. So am I pessimistic about COP28? Yes, I am, because I think people go in to fight the rhetoric. People don't fight for proving something that leads to a pragmatic solution. And I fear that one of the consequences of that will be lack of cooperation between countries, everybody digging their heels in, and nobody willing to actually sit down and have a sensible conversation about, okay, it's all good and well for us to say this is what we need to do, but let's talk about the reality of how we can do it. Dave, you and I have had many conversations, and many of the interviewers on your series of podcasts have all talked about one thing in common, no matter what. We do not yet have the tools or the scale or the preparation needed to meet the 1.5 degree target challenge, let alone a 2-degree challenge. Carbon finance needs to be raised into the trillions. And yet, as you know, people are squabbling over whether or not 100 billion in climate finance can be capable of being delivered within 10 years of the end of the Kyoto Protocol. I mean, for the love of God, 100 billion is nothing. It's a drop in the ocean. Some countries will say, thank you, I'll take that. But it's still a drop in the ocean compared to the trillions we need to solve the climate crisis if we're serious about it. But instead of talking about how do we get $1 trillion of money to move, we're fighting over whether or not $5 million of money will move into the GCF. And it's that difference in mindset that I think is holding us back. So yes, I do agree with you. We need a completely new mindset. That doesn't mean to say we need a completely different framework. I think the Paris Agreement can work. But we do need a completely different mindset as to how we focus on what is the most important objective of COP28 and all the other COPs, which is finding a solution to the decarbonization challenge.
Thanks again to Peter Zaman, partner at HFW in Singapore. We hope you enjoyed the episode. Join us next week as we continue our series, Commodities in Asia. We hope you'll join us.
This episode was brought to you in part by Abax Exchange. Market participants need the confidence and ability to secure funding for resource development, production, processing, refining, and transportation of commodities across the globe, with markets for LNG, battery metals, and emissions offsets at the core of the transition to sustainability. Abax Exchange is building solutions to manage risk in these rapidly changing global markets, facilitating futures and options contracts designed to offer market participants clear price signals and hedging capabilities in those markets essential to our sustainable energy transition. Abax Exchange, bringing you better benchmarks, better technology, and better tools for risk management. That concludes this week's episode of Smarter Markets by Abax. For episode transcripts and additional episode information, including research, editorial, and video content, please visit smartermarkets.media. Please help more people discover the podcast by leaving a review on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast platform. Smarter Markets is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Smarter Markets should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Smarter Markets are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or producer. Smarter Markets, its hosts, guests, employees, and producer, Abax Technologies, shall not be held liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on informational viewpoints presented on Smarter Markets. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.